Alright, hello fellow sapiens, welcome back to the channel. This is Jack Barnes, and tonight we're going somewhere that changed everything, and nobody voted on it. No war declared it. No single day marked it. It crept in through a handful of seeds someone decided not to eat, and by the time anyone noticed what was happening, there was no way back. So dim the lights, let your shoulders drop, and get comfortable, because tonight's story doesn't end in triumph. It ends in a trade we're all still paying off. This is the mistake that built civilization, the true cost of farming, and what we lost somewhere between 20,000 and 8,000 years before the Common Era. If this is the kind of slow, unhurried history that helps you drift off, consider subscribing. It helps more than you'd think, but there's no pressure tonight, just the story. Let's begin. Picture the world as it was before any of this happened. Not a wasteland, not an empty stage waiting for humans to arrive and do something with it, but a world already full, already known, already lived in with a fluency that took hundreds of thousands of years to build. 20,000 years before the Common Era, the last great cold snap of the Ice Age still has its hand on the land. Glaciers grip the far north, sea levels sit lower than they do today, low enough that coastlines we now think of as fixed and permanent are actually underwater memories, drowned real estate that once held camps, hearths, and footprints. Humans are spread thin across this world, but they are not struggling in the way the old cartoons imagined. They are reading the land the way a modern reader scans a page, quickly, fluently, without conscious effort. They know where the reindeer will cross in autumn. They know which valley holds water when the dry months come. They know the shape of a good flint nodule before they've even split it open. If you want to understand why farming eventually looked like a good idea to people who had survived for tens of thousands of years without it, you first have to understand how good the alternative already was, because the story of agriculture is not a story of humans finally figuring out how to feed themselves. It's a story of humans changing how they related to a world that had already been feeding them for a very long time. Let's stay in this pre-farming world a little longer before we watch it start to crack, because the shift that's coming only makes sense once you understand what was being given up. Somewhere in the grasslands and lake basins of the Near East, in the region that will later be called the Fertile Crescent, small bands of hunter-gatherers move with a rhythm shaped by nothing more complicated than water, wind, and appetite. They are not aimless wanderers. Archaeological work at sites in the Levant, places along the edges of the Jordan Valley and the hills above it, shows something that surprises people who still picture cavemen chasing mammoths with clubs. These bands often returned again and again to the same favoured spots, not because they were trapped there, but because those places worked. A bend in a river with reliable fish, a ridgeline with good sight lines and dependable game trails, a stand of wild cereals that ripened predictably every year and could be harvested with a simple flint sickle in a fraction of the time it took to track and kill an animal. This is one of the quieter truths about the transition to farming that gets lost in the popular story. People were not desperate. In many of these landscapes, wild wheat and barley grew in dense, almost field-like stands, and a family working together could gather enough grain in a few weeks to last months. The evidence from sites like Ohalo, on the ancient shore of what's now the Sea of Galilee, shows charred remains of wild barley, wheat, and dozens of other edible plants dating back over 20,000 years, along with grinding stones worn smooth from processing them. These are not the tools of people on the edge of starvation. These are the tools of people who had already figured out how to live well without planting a single seed. So why plant anything at all? This is where the story gets less like a straight line of progress and more like weather, unpredictable, external, and largely out of anyone's control. Around 12,900 years before the Common Era, the climate does something strange. After a long warming trend that had been gently coaxing the world out of the deep freeze, of the Ice Age, temperatures in much of the northern hemisphere suddenly drop again, hard and fast, in a cold snap that lasted roughly 1,200 years. Modern climate scientists call this the Younger Dryas, named for a small Arctic flower whose pollen shows up in the sediment layers marking the cold return. We don't know for certain exactly what triggered it, whether it was a sudden influx of glacial meltwater disrupting ocean currents or some other cause still debated in the literature, but we can see its fingerprints clearly in lake sediments, ice cores, and plant remains across Europe and the Near East. For the people living through it, the effect would have been brutal and disorienting. The dense, wild cereal stands that had made semi-settled life so comfortable begin to shrink and become unreliable. Familiar plants stop growing where they used to grow, herds shift their migration patterns to chase resources that are moving too. A way of life that had worked for generations suddenly stops working, not because people did anything wrong, but because the ground beneath their feet, quite literally, changed. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told with enough weight, because it complicates the tidy version where farming was simply a bright idea that humans stumbled onto. The evidence increasingly suggests something closer to a forced improvisation. In the hill country of the Levant, communities that had grown used to gathering dense, reliable stands of wild grain now found those stands thinning out, retreating to smaller, patchier areas as the climate dried and cooled. People who had once simply gone out and gathered what grew freely now had a choice to make: follow the shrinking wild stands into increasingly marginal and contested territory, or start doing something that had probably been observed for a very long time already, watching seeds fall near camp, watching them sprout, and beginning to nudge that process along on purpose. This is not a single eureka moment, it's a slow, uneven, region-by-region negotiation with a landscape that had stopped cooperating. Some groups doubled down on foraging, moving further and working harder to find the resources they needed. Others began experimenting, cultivating small plots near their camps, at first probably as a supplement rather than a replacement, insurance against a world that had become less predictable than it used to be. What makes this moment so quietly devastating, if you sit with it long enough, is that the earliest steps toward farming don't look like ambition. They look like anxiety. The archaeological signature of early cultivation, sites like Abu Huraira in what is now Syria, shows exactly this kind of layered transition. Deep beneath the settlement, the earliest layers show a community of skilled, well-fed hunter-gatherers exploiting a rich and diverse environment. Over 150 different plant species identified in the plant remains alone, alongside gazelle bones that show these people were highly effective hunters, following seasonal herd migrations with real precision. Then, as you move up through the layers coinciding with the onset of the younger Dryas cooling, the picture starts to shift. Wild plant diversity narrows. The proportion of cultivated cereal types increases. Gazelle bones, once dominant, begin to be joined and eventually partly replaced by the bones of domesticated sheep and goats. You are watching layer by layer, centimetre by centimetre, a community being squeezed by a changing world into a narrower and narrower set of choices, until the choice that once looked optional starts to look like the only one left. It's worth pausing here to notice something that the popular myth of agricultural progress tends to skip entirely, which is that this shift did not feel, to the people living through it, like an upgrade. We know this partly through comparison, through what anthropologists have observed among later hunter-gatherer societies who occasionally had the opportunity to adopt farming and sometimes deliberately chose not to, precisely because they recognized it as more work for less immediate reward. A skilled forager in a good environment might spend, by some estimates drawn from ethnographic studies of groups like the Hadza or the Juhuanzi, somewhere in the range of 20 to 30 hours a week on the actual business of finding food, with time left over for rest, craft, ritual, and each other. An early Farmer's Week looked nothing like that, clearing land without metal tools, breaking soil with a wooden or antler-digging stick, sowing by hand and hoping the season cooperated, weeding constantly, because a field left unweeded for even a short stretch could be swallowed by competing growth, guarding the crop from birds, from wild animals, from other hungry people, harvesting in a narrow window before the grain shattered and scattered itself uselessly onto the ground, threshing, winnowing, storing, and defending that storage from rot, from rodents, from theft. This was not a life of leisure traded for security. It was often a life of relentless, repetitive labour traded for a kind of security that, as we're about to see, was frequently an illusion. Because here's the cruel irony sitting at the centre of this whole transition, and it's one the skeletal record makes almost impossible to argue with. Farming did not, in its first several thousand years, make people healthier. It made a narrower set of foods available in larger quantities, and a narrow diet, however abundant, is not the same thing as a good one. Skeletons excavated from early farming communities across the Near East and later Europe show a measurable and consistent decline compared to their hunter-gatherer predecessors. Average height drops, in some regions by several centimetres, a marker researchers associate closely with childhood nutritional stress. Dental evidence shows a sharp rise in cavities and enamel defects, the signature of a diet suddenly dominated by starchy, sticky grain rather than the varied mix of tubers, greens, nuts, and lean game that foragers had relied on. Bones show new patterns of physical stress, the kind associated with the repetitive, bent-over labour of tending fields rather than the more varied, full-body demands of hunting and gathering. And population density, ironically the very thing farming was supposed to provide security against, becomes a health hazard in itself. When you concentrate people, and the animals they've begun to keep close, into permanent settlements, you also concentrate their waste, their parasites, and their pathogens. Many of the infectious diseases that would go on to define human history for thousands of years, measles, tuberculosis in some of its forms, various strains of influenza, likely trace their origins to this new intimacy between humans and their domesticated animals, an intimacy that simply didn't exist in the same way when people moved in small bands and rarely stayed anywhere long enough to build up that kind of shared biological burden. And so we arrive at the uncomfortable centre of tonight's story before we've even reached the walls, the kings, or the grain stores that history books like to open with. The people who first began cultivating grain in the hill country of the Levant, in the shadow of a climate that had turned against them, were not choosing progress over primitivism. They were making the best of a narrowing set of options, trading a life that was, by most measurable standards, healthier, more varied, and arguably more leisurely, for one that offered something else entirely, a kind of storable, transportable insurance against a world that had stopped being predictable. That insurance would eventually make possible everything we now call civilization, cities, writing, mathematics, empires, art on a scale foragers never attempted. But it did not arrive as a gift. It arrived as a compromise, forged under environmental pressure, paid for in shorter lifespans, harder labour, and diets poorer than the ones it replaced. That's the seed we're planting tonight, quite literally. And in the chapters ahead, we're going to watch it grow into something almost nobody who first pressed a grain of wild wheat into the soil could have imagined. Something that would eventually need walls to contain it, and something that, once it existed, could never really be undone. The next shift didn't come from the fields at all. It came from stone and from a hilltop that shouldn't have existed the way it does, built by people who, according to every rule we thought we understood about how civilizations form, weren't supposed to be capable of building anything like it yet. Let's talk about that hilltop now, because it forces us to rearrange everything we thought we knew about the order in which human ambition unfolds. For most of the 20th century, the story of civilization ran in a comfortable, linear direction. First came farming. Farming produced surplus. Surplus allowed some people to stop working the fields and start doing other things, building, organizing, praying. Surplus led to villages. Villages led to towns. Towns led to temples. And temples led to the gods getting proper houses to live in. It's a clean story, a staircase with a beginning and an end, and it fit neatly into a broader narrative that treated agriculture as the engine of everything that followed. Then, in the 1990s, in the rolling limestone hills of southeastern Anatolia, not far from the modern Turkish city of Şanlıurfa, archaeologists began excavating a site that had been dismissed for decades as an unremarkable medieval cemetery, a low rise of stone poking up from a landscape that had seen thousands of years of human passage. What they found underneath rewrote the staircase entirely, and in doing so, gave us one of the strongest clues we have about why people were willing to make the exhausting, health-eroding trade toward farming in the first place. Göbekli Tepe, radiocarbon dated to roughly the 12th millennium before the Common Era, sits comfortably in the period before agriculture had taken hold in any meaningful way in the region. The people who built it were still, by every measure archaeologists can apply, hunter-gatherers. There is no evidence at the earliest layers of domesticated crops, no evidence of a settled farming village nearby with granaries and permanent mud brick houses. And yet what they built there is staggering in its ambition. Massive, T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing many tons, arranged into circular and oval enclosures. carved with reliefs of foxes, boars, snakes, scorpions, vultures, and other creatures rendered with a level of artistic confidence that has nothing tentative or primitive about it. Quarrying, shaping, transporting, and erecting stones of that size using nothing but stone tools, rope, timber levers, and raw human labor would have required the coordinated effort of a very large number of people over a sustained period, feeding themselves and their working crews the whole time. That's the detail that changes everything. A project like this doesn't happen without organization. It doesn't happen without someone or some shared belief powerful enough to convince hundreds of people to gather again and again, season after season, and put in backbreaking labor on something that produces no food, no shelter, no immediate practical return at all. So the question archaeologists have been sitting with ever since is a genuinely uncomfortable one for the old staircase model. If farming wasn't yet established here, what fed the workforce that built this? And one of the more compelling answers, though still debated and refined as new excavation seasons uncover more of the site, is that Göbekli Tepe itself may have been part of the pressure that pushed people toward agriculture rather than a product of agriculture already in place. Analysis of wild einkorn wheat, one of the ancestral strains of domesticated wheat, points to genetic origins in exactly this region, the hills around the upper reaches of the Euphrates, not far from Göbekli Tepe itself. It's a striking coincidence, if it is a coincidence at all, that the very landscape where wheat first shows clear signs of human-guided selection is also the landscape where people were gathering periodically in large numbers for reasons that had nothing to do with farming and everything to do with something we might loosely call religion, ritual, or shared belief. Picture what that would have actually looked like on the ground. Bands of hunter-gatherers, otherwise scattered across a wide territory in small mobile groups for most of the year, converging periodically, perhaps for a specific season, perhaps tied to some now unrecoverable calendar of stars or migrations or ancestral memory at this one hilltop. Hundreds of people, maybe more, camping together for weeks or months at a stretch. And immediately you have a logistics problem that doesn't exist for a normal, small forager band. A group of 20 or 30 people can walk to wherever the food is. A temporary gathering of several hundred people cannot simply wander off to follow a herd, not without the whole point of gathering falling apart. They need food to come to them in bulk, reliably, at a predictable time. And one of the most efficient ways to guarantee that a specific patch of ground will produce a large harvestable quantity of food at a known moment in the year is, whether or not anyone framed it this way at the time, to plant it. Feasting refuse found at Göbekli Tepe supports exactly this kind of picture, enormous quantities of animal bone, particularly gazelle, suggesting not everyday subsistence eating, but the kind of large-scale ceremonial consumption you'd expect from a gathering built around shared meals, shared labor, and shared belief. It is entirely possible, and increasingly this is the direction serious scholarship on the site is leaning, that the sacred came before the practical, that people were not planting grain because they needed more calories to survive day to day, but because they needed a reliable way to feed a crowd that had gathered for reasons that had nothing to do with calories at all. If that's true, it inverts one of the oldest assumptions in the story of civilization. It suggests that agriculture may not have been invented to solve the problem of hunger. It may have been invented to solve the problem of gathering, the logistical challenge of keeping a large group of people fed in one place long enough to build something together, worship something together, or simply be something together that a scattered band of 30 people could never quite manage to be. Farming, in this reading, isn't the foundation civilization was built on top of. It's a byproduct of a much older, much stranger human impulse, the pull toward congregation, toward shared meaning, toward standing shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of others in front of something too large and too deliberate to have been made by any one person alone. And then, just as strangely as it was built, Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried, not abandoned to slow decay, not left to crumble under wind and rain the way ruins normally do, but intentionally backfilled, its massive enclosures packed with rubble, broken tools, and animal bone layer upon layer, until the towering pillars disappeared beneath an artificial hill of debris that the builders themselves seem to have created. This is one of the strangest and most debated aspects of the entire site. Why would a community, or a series of communities across generations, go to the trouble of hauling in enough material to bury a monument they had gone to such extraordinary lengths to build in the first place? Some researchers have proposed it was a kind of ritual closure, a way of retiring a sacred space once its purpose had been fulfilled, similar to practices seen in later cultures where sacred structures were deliberately decommissioned rather than left to fall apart on their own terms. Others have wondered whether the burial reflects a genuine rupture, a break with an older way of understanding the world, coinciding suspiciously with the period when agriculture in the surrounding region begins to take firmer hold. It's tempting and admittedly a little speculative to read the burial of Göbekli Tepe as a kind of closing of one chapter and opening of another, a moment when the animist, hunter-gatherer worldview embedded in those carved foxes and vultures and headless human figures started to give way to something more settled, more agricultural, more concerned with fields and seasons and ownership than with the wild, untamed spirits carved into those enormous stones. Whatever the true reason for its burial, and honestly, we may never know it with certainty, Göbekli Tepe leaves us with an idea worth sitting with as we move deeper into this story. The old assumption that religion, art, and grand shared ambition were luxuries civilization could only afford once farming had freed people from the daily grind of survival gets turned on its head here. It looks instead like the need to gather, to build, to worship together might have been one of the forces quietly pulling people toward the fields in the first place, alongside the environmental pressure of a hostile, unpredictable climate. Farming, in other words, wasn't only forced on people by drought and cooling temperatures. In some corners of this story, it may have been invited in by people chasing something less tangible than food, a shared roof, a shared ritual, a shared reason to stand still together in one place long enough to become something larger than a scattered band of 30. But whatever mixture of hunger and hope first pushed people toward that first, deliberately planted row of wild wheat, the moment it took hold, there was no gentle way back out of it. And it's in the years that follow, as scattered experiments in cultivation harden into permanent villages with mud brick walls and storage pits, and the first quiet whispers of who owns what, that the real cost of this whole arrangement starts to show up, not in the soil, but in the bones, the teeth, and the widening gap between the people who control the grain and the people who grow it. That widening gap is where we're headed next, into the first true farming villages of the Fertile Crescent, where the soil gave people something they'd never had before, a future they could plan for, and took something from them in return that they wouldn't fully understand they'd lost for thousands of years. Let's step now into one of these earliest farming villages properly, not as a passing observation, but as a place to actually stand in for a while, because this is where the abstraction of climate charts and pollen samples turns into something you can feel in your own body if you let yourself imagine it fully. We're somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, perhaps in the hill country, stretching from the Levant up through the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates, somewhere around the 10th millennium before the Common Era. The younger Dryas has finally released its grip. The climate has warmed and stabilized again, and in a strange twist, that stabilization doesn't send people rushing back to the old, fully mobile, foraging life. It does something almost the opposite. The improved, more predictable climate makes the small-scale cultivation that desperation had forced into existence during the cold snap suddenly far more productive and far more attractive to keep doing. What began as an emergency adaptation becomes, in more favorable conditions, a genuinely appealing way to live, at least on the surface, and the tentative, half-committed plots of wild-tending foragers start hardening into something new, permanent villages, with houses that are meant to be lived in year after year, rather than camps meant to be struck and carried onward with the seasons. This permanence is worth sitting with, because it represents one of the deepest psychological shifts in the entire human story, arguably deeper than the technology of farming itself. For nearly the entire span of human existence up to this point, home had been a pattern, not a place. A shelter was built where it was needed and left behind when the group moved on, sometimes to be rebuilt on the same spot next season, sometimes never returned to at all. Ownership of land in any sense we'd recognize the word today simply didn't exist as a meaningful concept, because nobody stayed anywhere long enough for the concept to matter. Early farming villages break that pattern completely. A mud brick house takes real labor to build, walls raised course by course from bricks that had to be mixed, shaped, and dried, roofs constructed from timber and reed and packed earth. That kind of investment only makes sense if you intend to still be living inside those walls next year, and the year after that. And the moment you build something you intend to return to indefinitely, you have, whether you meant to or not, planted the first seed of an idea that will eventually reshape almost everything about how humans organize themselves. This patch of ground is different from that patch of ground. This house is mine in a way the forest never was. The material evidence for this shift is remarkably rich, and one of the clearest places to see it unfold is at Jericho, in the Jordan Valley, a site whose deepest layers stretch back to roughly the 9th millennium before the Common Era and beyond. The earliest settlement there shows exactly the transitional picture we'd expect. Round houses, semi-subterranean at first in the older tradition of earlier hunter-gatherer shelters, gradually giving way to more substantial rectangular mud brick construction as the community's commitment to permanence deepens. And then, astonishingly early, we find something that changes the emotional register of the whole site. A massive stone tower, over 8 meters tall, with an internal staircase built alongside a substantial surrounding wall, at a settlement that predates the widespread use of pottery in the region. This is not the work of a handful of families protecting a garden plot. A structure like that requires sustained, coordinated labor from a community large enough and organized enough to quarry stone, haul it, and build upward with real architectural intent. And it requires that community to have decided, collectively, that something here was worth defending. Scholars still debate exactly what the tower was for: defense against flooding, a display of communal identity and permanence, protection against raiders drawn by the very grain stores that made this settled life possible in the first place. But whatever its precise purpose, its existence tells us something the bones will confirm again and again in the chapters ahead. The moment humans started storing surplus in one fixed place, they also created, for the first time in the species' history, something worth stealing and someone worth defending it from. This is where we need to look honestly at what daily life inside one of these villages actually demanded, because it's easy, from thousands of years' distance, to romanticize the birth of settled life as some kind of cozy upgrade, a move from precarious wandering to stable, dependable comfort. The archaeological and skeletal record tells a more complicated and often harder story. Skeletons recovered from early farming communities across the Fertile Crescent and, later, as agriculture spread into Europe, show a consistent and troubling pattern when compared directly to the hunter-gatherer populations that preceded them in the same regions. Average stature declines noticeably, a change researchers connect closely to periods of nutritional stress during childhood growth, when the body is most vulnerable to a diet that has narrowed dramatically compared to what foragers enjoyed. Where a forager's diet might draw on dozens or even over 100 different plant and animal species across a given year, shifting with the seasons and buffering against any single failure, early farmers increasingly stake their survival on a small handful of cereal crops, wheat and barley, chief among them in this region. That narrowing brought real advantages in raw caloric output per unit of land, which is precisely why it allowed populations to grow. But it also meant that if a harvest failed, a pest arrived, or a season turned unexpectedly dry, there was no thick cushion of alternative wild foods to fall back on the way there had been for tens of thousands of years before. Dental remains from these sites show a marked rise in cavities and enamel hypoplasia, the telltale lines and pits that form in tooth enamel during periods of childhood illness or malnutrition. Both signs of a diet now dominated by soft, starchy, sticky grain rather than the more varied, tougher forage of earlier populations. And skeletal markers of physical stress shift too, away from the more evenly distributed wear patterns of active foraging and hunting toward the specific, repetitive strain patterns associated with grinding grain by hand, hour after hour, day after day, a task that in many of these communities appears to have fallen disproportionately on women, whose skeletons from this period frequently show pronounced changes in the joints of the knees, spine, and arms consistent with exactly this kind of relentless, repetitive labor. And then there's the matter of the animals, because settled farming life didn't just mean living beside crops, it meant, increasingly, living beside herds. Sheep and goats appear in the archaeological record of these early villages not long after the plant cultivation itself takes hold, domesticated gradually from wild populations in the same hilly regions where wheat and barley were being tamed. Bringing animals into close, permanent proximity with human settlements solved real problems, a reliable source of meat, milk, wool, and labour that didn't depend entirely on the unpredictable success of a grain harvest. But it also solved those problems by creating an entirely new category of danger that simply hadn't existed at meaningful scale for foraging bands who rarely stayed anywhere long enough to build up this kind of shared biological exposure. Living in permanent structures in growing settlements alongside penned or loosely herded livestock, in close quarters with human and animal waste that a mobile lifestyle would previously have simply left behind with each move to a new camp, created ideal conditions for the transmission of disease between species. Many of the infectious illnesses that would go on to shape enormous stretches of later human history, various respiratory and gastrointestinal pathogens whose evolutionary origins researchers trace back to close human-animal contact in exactly this kind of settled, agrarian setting, likely trace their roots to precisely this period and precisely this new intimacy. It's a bitter irony worth sitting with. The very animals that offered farming villages a buffer against the failure of a single crop also, quietly and invisibly, opened the door to a category of threat that hunter-gatherer bands had rarely had to contend with in the same concentrated way, an enemy too small to see, spreading not through the forest, but through the shared floor of the very home people had worked so hard to build permanent enough to stay in. None of this means the people living through this transition experienced it as an unrelenting catastrophe, and it's worth resisting the temptation to flatten their experience into pure misery, just as much as we resisted flattening it into pure progress earlier in this story. There were real gains bundled inside this hard trade. A stored surplus of grain, however labour-intensive to produce, offered something foragers had never reliably had: a buffer against the lean months, a way to smooth out the harshest edges of a bad season, provided that season wasn't so bad it wiped out the harvest entirely. Permanent settlement allowed for a different kind of accumulated skill and craft, tools, textiles, pottery, forms of specialized labor and knowledge that were harder to develop and passed down in a life spent constantly on the move with only what could be carried. And there is evidence, subtle but real, in the growing elaboration of burial practices, personal ornamentation, and communal architecture at sites across this period that settled life allowed for new, richer expressions of identity, memory, and belonging tied to a specific place in a way that a life of constant movement for all its other freedoms simply hadn't offered in the same form. This is what makes the story genuinely difficult rather than simply tragic. It isn't that farming was purely a loss dressed up as progress, it's that it was a trade, made under real environmental pressure, sweetened by real ritual and communal ambition, and paid for in a currency, health, labour, and eventually freedom that the people making the trade could not possibly have understood the full price of, because the bill for this particular purchase would not come due all at once. It would arrive slowly, generation after generation, as villages grew into towns as grain stores grew large enough to be worth guarding, and as the question of who controlled that stored surplus began to matter more than almost anything else in these communities' lives. Because a permanent village with a full granary is not, it turns out, automatically an equal village, and it's in the slow, often invisible process of exactly who gets to decide how that grain is measured, stored, and distributed that the next great cost of this whole arrangement starts to reveal itself, a cost that has nothing to do with calories or calcium and everything to do with power. And it's there, in the birth of walls, hierarchy, and the very first quiet whispers of the word mine, that we're headed next. Now we need to talk about walls, and not in the abstract sense we touched on earlier when Jericho's tower first entered the story, but in the fuller, more unsettling sense of what a wall actually represents once you understand what's sitting behind it. A wall is not simply a barrier against wild animals or bad weather. Foragers managed those threats for hundreds of thousands of years without ever feeling the need to build anything on the scale of Jericho's tower. A wall like that exists to answer a very specific kind of threat, other humans. And the fact that this threat becomes serious enough to justify years of communal labor tells us something important has changed in how these settled communities relate not just to the land, but to each other. For the first time in the human story, at real scale, there is something sitting in one place, in large enough quantity, valuable enough, and vulnerable enough that it needs to be defended around the clock. Grain doesn't run, grain doesn't hide. A granary is a fixed target, and everyone within walking distance knows exactly where it is. This changes the entire calculus of human relationships in ways that ripple outward from the practical into the deeply social. In a foraging band, prestige and influence tended to be earned and re-earned constantly through skill, generosity, charisma, the ability to read the land, tell a good story, or lead a successful hunt. And it was notoriously difficult to convert that kind of earned respect into anything resembling permanent, inheritable advantage. You couldn't hoard your hunting skill and pass it down as wealth to a child who hadn't developed it themselves. Burial evidence from Paleolithic sites, while not entirely uniform, generally shows a strikingly egalitarian pattern, grave goods that don't vary wildly in quantity or richness from one individual to the next, suggesting a social world where status, while it certainly existed, rarely calcified into anything as rigid or as heritable as what comes next. Early farming villages begin to tell a very different story, and the shift is visible, slowly and then increasingly clearly, in the archaeological record of house sizes, burial goods, and the physical layout of settlements themselves. At sites across the Fertile Crescent and later Neolithic Europe, archaeologists begin to find houses that differ meaningfully in size and construction quality within the same settlement. Burials where some individuals are accompanied by beads, polished stone tools, or rare imported materials in quantities that dwarf what their neighbours were buried with, and eventually, as we move further into the story, storage structures that appear to be controlled not communally, but by specific households or specific individuals within a household. Çatalhöyük, the remarkable Neolithic settlement in central Anatolia, dating from roughly the 8th to 6th millennia before the Common Era, offers one of the richest windows into what daily life inside this new, denser, more hierarchical arrangement actually look like, it's a genuinely strange place by modern standards, a densely packed cluster of mud brick houses built wall to wall with no streets at all between them, entered not through doors but through openings in the roof, accessed by ladder, so that the entire settlement functioned almost like a single interconnected honeycomb that you moved across by walking over your neighbour's rooftops. Inside, houses were plastered and replastered repeatedly, decorated with elaborate murals, and in some cases the floors held burials of the community's own dead directly beneath where the living continued to sleep, eat, and work, generation layered on top of generation in the same physical space. It's an image that captures something important about this new relationship between people and place, life and death, no longer separated by distance and forgetting the way they often were for foraging bands who moved on from where someone had died, but folded together, literally underfoot, in a settlement that intended to remain exactly where it was indefinitely. And Çatalhöyük's skeletal remains, studied extensively over decades of excavation, confirm the harder physical costs we've already traced. Evidence of repetitive strain from grain grinding, a diet heavily dependent on cereals with the dental and nutritional consequences that implies. Signs of crowding-related infectious disease more common here than in the more dispersed populations that came before. And, troublingly, evidence of interpersonal violence, healed and unhealed skull fractures found on a meaningful portion of excavated individuals, a pattern that, while not proof of organized warfare in the way we'd recognize it later, suggests a level of close-quarters social friction that a more mobile, lower-density foraging life had rarely produced at this scale. Density, it turns out, doesn't just concentrate grain and disease, it concentrates people's grievances too, jealousies, disputes over resources, tensions that in a foraging band could often be resolved simply by one party walking away and joining a different group entirely, an option that becomes far harder to exercise once your entire identity, your labour investment, your stored food, and your ancestors are all buried in one specific, immovable patch of ground. This is also, not coincidentally, the period in which we start to see the first real evidence of organised, large-scale violence between communities, rather than the smaller, more personal disputes that likely characterised conflict throughout most of human prehistory. One of the most striking and sobering pieces of evidence for this comes from a site called Nataruk, near Lake Turkana in modern Kenya, dated to roughly 10,000 years before the Common Era, right at the edge of this transitional period. There, archaeologists uncovered the remains of at least 27 individuals, men, women, and children, showing clear evidence of violent death, blunt force trauma, embedded projectile points, wounds consistent with close-quarters attack, all apparently killed in a single event and left where they fell rather than given any kind of burial. It's one of the earliest sites that looks less like an isolated act of individual violence and more like something approaching organized conflict between groups. And its timing sits right at the hinge point we've been tracing throughout tonight's story, a period when growing populations, shrinking resource margins under environmental stress, and the earliest experiments in claiming and defending fixed territory were all converging at once. We should be careful not to overclaim what a single site can tell us, but taken alongside the broader pattern, The walls, the towers, the healed skull fractures at Çatalhöyük, the growing inequality visible in grave goods. It paints a picture that complicates any simple story of farming as humanity's peaceful graduation into civilized life. What it looks like, more honestly, is a species running an enormous, unplanned experiment in what happens when you take beings shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of relatively low density, high mobility, resource-sharing social life, and suddenly ask them to live crowded, stationary, and unequal, defending a fixed pile of stored wealth that some among them have far more access to than others. It's worth pausing on that word, unequal, because it's doing enormous work in this story, and it's easy to let it pass by too quickly. Inequality in a foraging band, to whatever extent it existed, was rarely inheritable in any durable sense, and it was constantly checked by the simple mechanics of mobile life. You can't accumulate what you can't carry, and reputation has to be constantly re-earned rather than banked. A farming village breaks both of those checks at once. Land, once cleared and cultivated, becomes something that can be held, improved, and passed down. A good harvest one year can be stored, and that stored surplus can be lent, withheld, or used to command the labor of others in ways that simply had no equivalent in the foraging world. Once you can store wealth, you can also inherit it. And once you can inherit it, advantages that started as pure chance, a slightly better plot of land, a slightly larger harvest, a slightly earlier claim to a good water source, begin to compound across generations in a way nothing in the previous several 100,000 years of human social organization had ever really allowed. This is, in a very real sense, the quiet birth of what we'd later call class, not proclaimed in any founding document, not decided by any council, but accumulating silently, harvest by harvest, granary by granary, inheritance by inheritance, until the gap between the household with the largest storage pit and the household with the smallest becomes wide enough to be visible in the size of their houses, the richness of their graves, and eventually the number of people they could compel to work on their behalf. And this is where we start to see the first faint outlines of something that will, thousands of years later, harden into kings, priesthoods, and the earliest formal states, though we're still a considerable distance from anything like that in the period we're discussing tonight. What we can see clearly in the archaeological record of these early farming settlements is the raw material such structures would eventually be built from unequal access to stored surplus, the beginnings of specialized roles within the community that don't directly produce food, evidence at some sites of communal ritual structures whose construction and maintenance would have required someone with the authority to organize labor beyond their own household, and, running underneath all of it, the walls, the towers, the healed wounds, a settled population that had, for the first time in the species' long history, created something worth fighting to keep and worth fighting to take. The forager who walked away from a bad situation, and the farmer who could not, who had a house, a field, a buried grandmother, and a granary that represented an entire year's accumulated labor rooting them to one specific patch of ground, were living in a very real and measurable sense in two different moral universes. One where conflict could usually be resolved by distance, and one where it increasingly had to be resolved by walls or by force. We'll leave the village here for now, walls standing, grains stored, some households larger than others, the dead buried underfoot rather than left behind on the trail. In the chapter ahead, we're going to widen the lens and watch this pattern repeat and intensify as it spreads outward from these first hesitant hilltop experiments in the Fertile Crescent into the wider world, following rivers, crossing seas, moving with migrating farmers and, just as often, with borrowed ideas carried by people who had never planted a seed themselves but had heard from a trading partner or a passing stranger that there was a better way to guarantee you'd eat next winter. We're going to watch calendars get invented to track the planting season, watch the first debts get recorded because someone borrowed grain in a hungry month and now owes it back with interest, and watch the very earliest, faintest signs of writing emerge, not as poetry, not as philosophy, but as an accounting trick, a way to remember exactly how much barley is owed and to whom, born from the same anxious, careful hoarding instinct that built the first granary walls we've been standing beside tonight. Let's widen the lens now, because up to this point we've been standing in one place in the hill country of the Levant, watching one set of villages work out one set of consequences. But an idea like this, once it exists, doesn't stay where it was born. It leaks, it travels, and the way it travels tells us almost as much about human nature as the invention itself did. You've probably been told at some point in some documentary with a sweeping orchestral score and an arrow drawn confidently across a map that farming spread the way a good idea should spread, outward from its birthplace in a single triumphant wave, sweeping across Anatolia, down into the Aegean, up through the Balkans, along the river valleys of Central Europe, until within a few thousand years the whole continent had abandoned the old mobile life and taken up the plough. It's a tidy picture. It's also, like so much of the tidy version of this story, more of a simplification than a truth. The real spread of agriculture out of the Fertile Crescent was slower, stranger, and far more contested than that arrow suggests, and in places it looked less like a triumph and more like a very long, very cautious negotiation between two ways of living that did not trust each other, and, in some cases, had every reason not to. Here's what the evidence actually shows once you start looking closely at the archaeology and, more recently, at the ancient DNA that's been pulled from skeletons across this whole span of territory. Farming did move west and north out of Anatolia, but it moved as two different things happening at once, sometimes together, and sometimes very much not. In one sense, it moved as people, actual bodies, actual families, packing up seed grain and breeding stock and walking, generation by generation, into new country. Geneticists studying ancient remains from sites across the Aegean and into the Balkans can trace this migration directly in the DNA, populations genetically distinct from the hunter-gatherers who had lived in Europe for tens of thousands of years, showing up in the archaeological record alongside the first appearance of domesticated wheat, barley, sheep, and goat, and showing up specifically in places with the right kind of soil and climate for this particular package of crops and animals to actually work. This is the part of the story that really did look like a wave, farmers moving into new territory roughly a kilometre a year on average, according to some of the modelling done on the spread through the Balkans and into Central Europe, which sounds slow until you realise that's still fast enough to cross a continent in well under 2,000 years. But that's only half of what was happening, and it's the half that fits the old triumphant arrows story, which is probably why it got told more often. The other half is messier and, honestly, more interesting. In plenty of places along this frontier, farming didn't arrive with new bodies at all. It arrived as an idea, carried by trade, by intermarriage, by whatever conversation happens between two groups who meet at the edge of their respective territories and notice the other one is doing something worth paying attention to. Hunter-gatherer populations already living in these landscapes, people who had their own tens of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about the land, sometimes simply adopted pieces of the farming package on their own terms, picking up domesticated animals here, a cultivated grain there, without wholesale abandoning the mobile, varied life they already knew worked. Along parts of the Atlantic coast of Europe and up into Scandinavia, this frontier zone didn't last decades. It lasted centuries in some regions, well over 1,000 years, foragers and farmers living within reach of each other, watching each other, trading with each other, and in some documented cases quite deliberately choosing not to fully cross over, even when they clearly understood exactly what farming involved and exactly what it would cost them in labour. That last detail is worth sitting with for a moment because it cuts directly against the idea that farming's spread was simply a matter of everyone eventually recognizing a superior technology and adopting it as fast as they could. There is coastal evidence, particularly from parts of northern Europe, of communities living for centuries right next door to established farming populations, fully aware of agriculture, fully capable of adopting it, and choosing instead to keep hunting, fishing, and gathering in landscapes rich enough that the trade simply didn't look worth making yet. Some of these groups only shifted to farming much later, and when they did, isotope analysis of their bones and teeth sometimes shows the change happening remarkably fast once it started, within a generation or two, suggesting it wasn't a slow, dawning realization so much as a decision made under pressure or opportunity we can only partly reconstruct, to finally cross a line they'd been standing beside for a very long time. And where the two populations did meet and mix rather than one simply replacing the other, the archaeological and genetic record shows something that also complicates the clean conquest version of this story. In several regions, particularly across parts of Central and Western Europe, ancient DNA reveals extended periods of genuine mixing between incoming farmer populations and the resident hunter-gatherers, intermarriage, shared settlements, children carrying ancestry from both groups. This wasn't, in most places, one population sweeping the other off the map. It was something closer to two very different ways of understanding food, land, and time slowly folding into each other, unevenly, over centuries, with the balance of that mixture shifting from region to region depending on local conditions, local resistance, and, we have to assume, local relationships that left no trace we can read in bone or genome. What's easy to miss in all of this, if you're only looking at the big continental picture, is what the actual frontier must have felt like to the people living on it, and this is worth pausing on, because it's the kind of texture that gets flattened out of the arrow on a map version entirely. Imagine being a forager in one of these contact zones, watching a farming settlement go up not far from your own territory, watching people you may have traded with, married into, or fought with over the years commit themselves to a life you understood perfectly well, having watched it and having decided so far that it wasn't worth what it cost. You'd have seen the fields, the fences, the constant weeding, the vulnerability to a single bad season in a way your own varied, mobile diet simply wasn't vulnerable. You'd also, over time, have started to notice the other side of the ledger, the population growth. Farming villages, for all their harder labour and poorer average health, could support far more people per square kilometre of land than a foraging band ever could, and more people, generation after generation, eventually means more pressure on the surrounding territory, more competition for the hunting and gathering grounds that foragers on the frontier depended on. In more than one region, it looks less like foragers were persuaded that farming was a better life, and more like farming's raw demographic advantage, more mouths fed per acre. However grim the average health of each of those mouths, slowly squeezed the foraging alternative out of viable existence around them, whether anyone on either side ever framed it in those terms or not. This is, in its own quiet way, another version of the trade we've been tracing all along. Individually, generation by generation, a hunter-gatherer household on the frontier might have looked at a neighbouring farming household and seen shorter people, worse teeth, harder joints, more disease, and correctly concluded they weren't looking at an improvement. But population is not a single household's decision. A farming community that can double its numbers every few generations, however much thinner and harder each of those individual lives runs, will eventually outnumber, outproduce, and outcompete a foraging community capped by what a mobile life on unmanipulated land can support, no matter how much healthier and freer that unmanipulated life actually was. The trade wasn't only being made by individuals choosing agriculture over foraging. It was being made invisibly at the level of population itself, and once that dynamic gets underway, no individual household's better judgment is enough to stop it. By the time farming has pushed its way across most of Europe, spread down the Nile, taken root independently, and on its own separate timeline in the river valleys of China, and emerged again, independently still, in Mesoamerica and the highlands of New Guinea, we're no longer looking at a single story radiating out from one hilltop in Anatolia. We're looking at something closer to a pattern the species kept arriving at, over and over, on different continents, under different climates, from different starting crops, whenever the same basic pressure showed up. Enough environmental instability to make the old, fully mobile life harder to sustain, combined with a wild plant or animal in the local landscape suitable for the same slow, patient process of selection and control. Wheat and barley in the Fertile Crescent, rice and millet along the rivers of China, maize, beans, and squash in Mesoamerica. Different crops, different timelines, sometimes separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, and yet strikingly similar consequences everywhere they took hold: permanence, inequality, denser populations, harder labour, and a slow tightening of the relationship between people and the ground beneath their feet. We're going to leave the map here because there's a more intimate shift waiting for us now, one that happened inside these settlements rather than between them. It has to do with time itself, and with what happens to a species that spent hundreds of thousands of years reading the sky and the seasons purely for survival, once it starts needing to read them for something else entirely, for a schedule that other people are depending on you to keep. Before there were calendars in any form we'd recognize, there was the sky. And for a very long time, the sky was enough. For nearly the entire span of human existence, time wasn't something you tracked so much as something you lived inside, cyclical, repeating, marked by the return of familiar things, the same stars climbing the same part of the horizon at the same point in the cooling year, the same migrating herds appearing on schedule at the mouth of the same valley, the same wild grain ripening in the same weeks it had ripened the year before and the year before that, back further than anyone in the band could remember, back into the stories the elders told about how it had always been this way. This was time as rhythm rather than time as measurement, and it asked something very different of the human mind than the kind of time we live inside today. You didn't need to count the days until the reindeer crossed the river. You needed to know the land well enough that you'd simply be there when it happened, the way you know, without counting, that it's almost dinner time. There's real evidence that people were tracking cycles with real precision long before anything like farming existed, and it's worth pausing on this because it undercuts the old assumption that careful, disciplined observation of time was something civilization invented out of necessity. Notched bones recovered from sites across Africa and Europe, some of them tens of thousands of years old, show patterns of marks that many researchers interpret as records of lunar cycles, tallies kept, quite possibly, by people tracking the moon for reasons we can only partly reconstruct now. Ritual timing. The coordination of gatherings, perhaps even, in the case of some contested but seriously argued interpretations, the tracking of a woman's own reproductive cycle. Whatever the precise purpose, the underlying capability, patient, repeated observation of a cycle translated into a physical record that could be checked and referred back to was already sitting inside the human mind tens of thousands of years before anyone needed it to schedule a harvest. What farming did wasn't to invent this capacity, it was to change what the capacity was for, and in doing so, it changed the texture of time itself. A forager's relationship to the cycle of the seasons was, for the most part, responsive. You watched, you noticed, you moved when the signs told you to move. A farmer's relationship to the same cycle has to be anticipatory, and the difference between those two postures is enormous, even though it might sound subtle. You can't wait until the wild grain is visibly ripening to decide it's time to plant, because by the time you can see that a season has arrived, the window to prepare for it has already closed. You have to know in advance exactly when to break the soil, exactly when to sow, exactly how many weeks before the first frost the last safe planting can go in the ground. Farming takes the old cyclical relationship with the sky, which had always been about recognition, and turns it into something closer to obligation. The season is no longer simply arriving. It's a deadline you're accountable to, and if you miss it, there's no wild abundance somewhere else to fall back, on the way a forager could shift ground and follow a different resource. You've committed your whole year's labor to one patch of dirt, and the sky now holds power over that commitment in a way it never quite held over a life spent simply reading and responding to the land as it changed. This shift shows up in the archaeological record in some genuinely striking places, and one of the most remarkable is a site called Nabta Playa, Out in the hyper-arid desert of southern Egypt, far from any river, in a landscape that during a brief and long-vanished wetter phase of the early Holocene supported semi-nomadic cattle-herding communities who returned to the same basin seasonally for water and grazing. Sometime around the 6th millennium before the Common Era, these communities built a modest circle of standing stones, aligned, according to the archaeoastronomers who've studied it since its excavation, with the position of the summer solstice sunrise roughly the point in the year when seasonal rains that made this basin livable at all would have been expected to arrive. It predates the famous stone circles of northern Europe by well over 1,000 years, and what makes it so revealing for our purposes tonight isn't just its age, but what it represents functionally. This is a community using monumental, durable stone architecture, not to store grain or defend a granary, but to fix a moment in the yearly cycle permanently in the landscape, to build a physical, unmissable anchor for a piece of knowledge that had previously lived only in memory, passed down through observation and story. It's the human mind externalizing its calendar, taking something that used to live entirely inside the collective memory of the group and pinning it, instead, to stone, where it would still be readable even if the people who understood why it mattered had died, or forgotten, or simply weren't paying attention that particular year. That act, externalizing time, fixing it outside the living memory of any single person, is one of the quieter turning points in this whole story, and it's worth sitting with the emotional weight of it rather than just the technical achievement, because something real gets traded away in the process. A cyclical, myth-carried sense of time, the kind foragers had lived inside for hundreds of thousands of years, tends to be forgiving in a particular way. If a story about when the herds arrive drifts slightly across generations, if a ritual shifts by a few days from one telling to the next, very little breaks. The land itself is still the real authority, and the story simply adjusts to match what the land is actually doing. A fixed calendar, especially once it starts getting used to coordinate planting, harvest, tribute, and eventually taxation, doesn't have that same forgiveness built into it. Once a date is written down, carved into stone or later recorded on a clay tablet, the date itself starts to carry authority independent of what's actually happening in the fields, and the people living under that calendar increasingly have to answer to the date rather than the date answering to them. You can see this hardening happening gradually across the farming settlements we've already spent time in tonight, in the layout of storage structures built to hold a harvest that has to be measured out carefully across an entire year until the next one arrives. In the emergence, at sites slightly later than the ones we've discussed so far, of the earliest ritual calendars tied explicitly to agricultural obligation, festivals marking the start of planting, festivals marking the harvest, festivals whose timing is no longer simply observed, but actively enforced by whoever in the community has taken on the responsibility or claimed the authority of knowing exactly when those moments fall, and this is where the thread we picked up back at Göbekli Tepe starts to braid back into the story in an unexpected way. If ritual gathering really did help pull people toward the fields in the first place, then it makes a certain grim sense that ritual would also be one of the first institutions pressed into service to keep them there once the fields existed, giving sacred weight and communal enforcement to a schedule that individual households, left entirely to their own judgment, might otherwise have been tempted to treat more loosely than a fragile harvest could actually afford. There's a version of this story that frames the invention of the fixed calendar as pure triumph. Humanity finally mastering time the way it had already mastered fire. And there's some truth buried in that framing, because a community that can reliably predict the seasons, can plan in ways no purely responsive forager ever could, can store with more precision, can coordinate labour across dozens or hundreds of households toward a shared planting or harvest date, can build the kind of long-term, multi-generational projects, irrigation channels, monumental architecture, that simply aren't possible for a group living entirely inside the responsive, cyclical rhythm of the old world. But it's worth naming plainly what got left behind in that mastery. A forager who lost track of exactly which day it was lost almost nothing, because the land itself was still the timekeeper, patient and self-correcting. A farmer who lost track of exactly which day it was risked the harvest, and once whole communities were depending on shared, coordinated timing to survive the year, keeping track of the day stopped being a personal convenience and started becoming, quietly, and almost without anyone deciding it should, everyone's business, everyone's obligation, and eventually someone's job. And once time is something that has to be tracked precisely on behalf of a whole community by someone whose responsibility that specifically is, we're only one very small step away from the next great shift waiting for us, because a person who's responsible for remembering exactly when the harvest is due is not far at all from a person who's responsible for remembering exactly how much of that harvest each household actually owes. Let's follow that thread all the way to its uncomfortable end, because it leads us somewhere that rarely gets the weight it deserves in the popular story of how civilization got its start. We tend to imagine the great human leap into recorded history arriving with poetry, with the first epic, the first prayer, the first line of law carved for its own moral weight. It didn't. It arrived as bookkeeping. The earliest writing our species ever produced wasn't written to be read for meaning at all, in the way we now read meaning into a story or a psalm. It was written to be checked, the way you check a receipt, and the story of how it got that way begins not with a scribe and a stylus, but with a small handful of clay pushed into simple shapes by hands that had absolutely no idea they were building the foundation of literacy itself. You've probably been told, if you've thought about the invention of writing at all, that it arrived more or less fully formed, a sudden flash of insight, someone somewhere deciding one day to start drawing pictures that meant words. What the archaeological record actually shows is slower, stranger, and far more tied to the specific anxieties of the settled, surplus holding world we've spent the last few chapters building. Long before anything resembling a written sentence existed, communities across the Fertile Crescent, stretching back even into the earlier farming villages we sat in during Chapter 5, were using small, hand-shaped clay tokens, cones, spheres, discs, cylinders, each shape apparently standing for a specific quantity of a specific good. A particular cone might represent a measure of grain, a particular sphere might represent a jar of oil. These tokens have been found by the thousands at sites across the region, some dating back nearly as far as the earliest permanent farming settlements themselves, and, for a long time, Archaeologists weren't entirely sure what to make of them. Small clay objects that looked almost like a child's toy, scattered through the debris of ordinary households and, increasingly as time goes on, through the debris of buildings that look less like ordinary households and more like something else entirely. Here's what these tokens were actually for, once you understand the pressure that had been building since the very first granary got sealed shut behind Jericho's tower. A stored surplus is only useful if everyone with a claim on it can trust that the claim is being honoured accurately, and the moment more than one household, or more than one family within a household, starts contributing grain to a shared store, or borrowing from it in a lean month, or owing a portion of a harvest to someone else as the price of using their land or their ox or their labour, you have a problem that the old world of purely oral, purely relational memory was never built to solve at scale. Memory is a wonderful tool for a small foraging band where everyone knows everyone, and every debt, if the word even applies, is settled through ongoing relationship, reciprocity, and reputation, paid back not necessarily in kind, but in the general, flexible currency of mutual obligation that binds a small group together over a lifetime. That kind of memory does not scale. It cannot hold accurately and without dispute the exact number of measures of barley that 40 different households have stored in a shared granary, contributed at different times in different quantities, with different portions already withdrawn. Something had to hold that information that wasn't a fallible human memory subject to convenient forgetting. And clay, it turns out, does not forget, does not soften a debt out of sympathy, and does not quietly let an old obligation fade the way a person eventually might. The tokens were the first answer, a physical, external memory for exactly how much was owed, by whom, of what. And they get more sophisticated as the pressure on this system builds. At some sites, archaeologists have found these tokens sealed inside small hollow clay balls, now generally called bullae, essentially a clay envelope enclosing a specific set of tokens representing a specific transaction, a kind of tamper-evident record that could be broken open later to verify exactly what had been agreed to and by how much, and to settle any dispute about whether that agreement was actually being honoured. And then comes the detail that turns this whole slow, patient system of accounting into something genuinely new. At some point, whoever was sealing these bullae seems to have realized that pressing the actual tokens into the soft outer surface of the clay envelope before sealing it inside left a clear impression, a record of exactly what was enclosed, visible on the outside, without having to break the seal open at all. And once you have that, once the outer marking itself carries all the information the enclosed tokens carried, the tokens themselves start to become unnecessary. You don't need to seal the object anymore. You can just make the marks. That's it. That's the moment. Not a poet reaching for a way to capture beauty, not a priest reaching for a way to record a prayer, but an anonymous administrator somewhere in the temple or storehouse economy of the growing settlements of the Fertile Crescent, sometime in the 4th millennium before the Common Era, most clearly documented at the great early city of Uruk in what's now southern Iraq, realizing that a mark pressed into wet clay could carry the same information a physical object used to carry, and doing that at scale again and again, thousands of times, for grain, for livestock, for cloth, for labour owed and labour performed, until those marks Stop being simple pictures of the objects they represent and start compressing into something more abstract, more efficient, faster to make and faster to read. The earliest true writing system our species ever produced, proto-cuneiform, born not from inspiration but from the accumulated, grinding administrative weight of a surplus economy that had finally outgrown human memory's capacity to hold it honestly. It's worth sitting with just how unromantic this origin actually is, because it tells us something true and a little bit devastating about what settled, surplus-based life had actually done to the human relationship with memory itself and with each other. The overwhelming majority of the earliest written tablets recovered from Uruk and sites like it aren't stories. They aren't hymns. They aren't even, in most cases, anything we'd recognize as communication between equals. They're ration lists, their tallies of grain distributed to labourers, their records of debt, so many measures of barley owed by this household to that temple, to be repaid by this date, with, in some of the more developed later records, something that looks very much like interest accruing on the unpaid balance. The very first sentence, in the loosest sense that our species ever fixed permanently outside a living human mind, was, in essence, an IOU. And the mind that needed it fixed that way wasn't reaching for beauty or truth. It was reaching for control over exactly who owed what to whom. In a world that had grown too large, too surplus-heavy, and too unequal for the old, forgiving, relationship-based memory of the forager's world to hold it fairly anymore. And this is where the psychological cost of this whole trade takes on a shape we haven't quite named yet in this story, because up to now we've mostly been talking about bodies, about height and teeth and joints and disease. This is a cost that lands somewhere else entirely. In the old world, a debt, to whatever extent the concept even applied, was elastic. It lived inside an ongoing relationship, and relationships have a way of forgiving things that a ledger never does. If you helped a neighbouring family through a hard season, you didn't do it because you expected a precisely measured, interest-bearing return. You did it because that was how the whole fabric of mutual survival worked, and the accounting, such as it was, lived in memory, in reputation, in the soft, self-correcting judgment of people who had to keep living beside each other for the rest of their lives. A clay tablet doesn't have that softness. A clay tablet doesn't remember that your harvest failed this year through no fault of your own. It simply states the number, and the number is now real in a way it never quite was before, external, durable, citable, and increasingly enforceable by whoever controls the temple or the storehouse the tablet was written on behalf of. Once debt could be written down, it could also, for the first time, be genuinely permanent, transferable, and inherited, a burden that could outlast the specific relationship or specific hardship that created it and simply keep existing on the record until it was paid. We are quite literally sitting at the birth of an idea that will go on to shape almost every civilization that follows this one, the idea that an obligation between people can exist independently of the people themselves, can be held by an institution rather than a relationship, and can be enforced by something colder and more absolute than a neighbour's understanding. There's a reason we've spent this much time on something as unglamorous as clay tokens and grain tallies, and it's this. Every story we tell about the birth of civilization tends to celebrate writing as one of humanity's crowning achievements. The moment thought became permanent. The moment ideas could travel beyond a single lifetime. All of that is true, and we shouldn't pretend it isn't a genuine, remarkable expansion of what the human mind could do. But it's worth remembering, on a night like tonight, that the very first thing our species chose to make permanent, the very first thought it decided was worth fixing outside a living, forgiving human mind, wasn't a poem, wasn't a prayer, wasn't even a story about where we came from. It was a number. It was who owed what. And once that kind of permanent record exists, once it can be pointed to, appealed to, and ultimately enforced, we've built something that will very quickly need someone to enforce it, someone whose job, whose entire social position depends on knowing exactly what the tablets say and making sure the people who owe what those tablets record actually pay it. That's where we're headed next, into the hands that held the stylus and the walls that grew up around them. If the last chapter was about the invention of a record, this one is about what happens once someone decides that keeping the record is a job. And a job, once it exists, tends to come with a particular kind of power attached to it that's easy to miss if you're only looking at the clay itself. Think about what it actually means to be the one person or one small handful of people in a growing settlement who can read the tallies. Everyone else in the community can see the tablet, can watch the marks being pressed into the wet clay, can even understand in a general sense what it's supposed to represent: grain, debt, labour, owed. But only a small, increasingly specialized group can actually decode it with confidence, can settle a dispute about what it says, can tell a farmer with absolute, unchallengeable authority exactly how much barley they owe and by when. That asymmetry, the gap between the people who can read the record and the people who can only be read to, is one of the quietest and most consequential kinds of power our species had ever created up to this point, and it took root not in a throne room, but in a storehouse doing math. We know quite a lot about how this played out at Uruk specifically because it's the best documented early urban centre from this period, and the picture that emerges from the tens of thousands of administrative tablets recovered, there is not, on the whole, a picture of shared communal record keeping. It's a picture of institutional control, concentrated first in the hands of temple administrations dedicated to specific deities, organizations that by this point in the fourth millennium before the Common Era were functioning less like purely religious institutions in the modern sense and more like combined temple, treasury and central storehouse all at once, controlling substantial agricultural land, employing large numbers of dependent labourers, and, crucially, holding the accumulated administrative memory of the entire settlement's economic life in their archives. The temple didn't just hold grain, it held the record of who had contributed what, who had borrowed what, who owed labour, and who had already paid theirs. And the people who could read and write those records, the earliest scribes trained through years of apprenticeship in an increasingly complex system of signs, held a position that had no real equivalent in the world we spent our early chapters in tonight, a position whose power came not from hunting skill, not from storytelling, not from charisma, but from privileged access to a permanent, external memory that everyone else in the community had to trust, because almost none of them could check it for themselves. This is worth pausing on because it's easy to think of the birth of writing purely as a story about communication improving, and to miss the fact that for a very long stretch of its early history, writing functioned less like communication and more like surveillance. The overwhelming bulk of the tablets recovered from this period aren't records that flowed both ways, between equals, checking each other's honesty. They flow almost entirely one direction, from the institution downward or from the individual upward to be checked by the institution. Ration lists recording exactly how much grain, oil and beer each category of worker received, calibrated with real precision by rank and role, more for a supervisor, less for an unskilled labourer. A specific, itemised allowance for the temple's dependent workforce that reads, honestly, less like generosity and more like a wage bill drawn up by someone counting every measure carefully enough that nothing extra slips through. Records of goods entering and leaving central storehouses tracked by category by quantity and increasingly by the specific individual or household responsible for each transaction. Labour rosters tracking who showed up for communal work obligations and who didn't. This is the birth, in its earliest and most literal form, of the state's ability to see its own population clearly enough to manage it, tax it, and, when it judged necessary, punish it, an ability that simply did not and could not exist in the same way in the world of small, mobile foraging bands, where no one held a permanent, external record of who had contributed what to the group, because no one needed to, because the group itself, through direct, ongoing relationship, was the only record that existed. It's tempting to read this development as something imposed from above by people who had already grabbed power and were now simply consolidating it with a useful new tool. And there's certainly truth in that reading, but it's worth sitting too with how much of this system likely grew, at least at first, out of a genuinely practical problem that a growing settlement simply had no other way to solve. A community of 30 people spread across a shared foraging territory doesn't need a centralized authority to manage its food supply, because the food supply isn't centralized in the first place. It's distributed across the landscape itself, in the plants and animals that everyone in the band knows how to find. A community of several thousand people living in permanent mud brick housing, dependent on a small number of cultivated staple crops, stored in a limited number of central granaries, has a genuinely different problem. Someone has to decide how much grain gets released this month, how much gets held in reserve against a bad harvest next year, how the temple's substantial land holdings actually get worked, and by whom, and how the whole apparatus gets fed and organized without collapsing into either chaos or starvation. Writing in this light wasn't purely a tool of oppression invented by people scheming to dominate their neighbors. It was also quite genuinely a solution to a coordination problem that scale itself had created, a problem that simply hadn't existed back when every band was small enough to coordinate through nothing more than conversation and memory. But here's the trouble with a solution like that, and it's a trouble that runs through the rest of human history from this point forward, largely unbroken. A tool built to solve a genuine coordination problem does not stay neutral for very long once it's also, conveniently, a tool that concentrates knowledge and therefore power in the hands of whoever operates it. The temple administrations at Uruk weren't simply passive record keepers waiting patiently to be consulted whenever a dispute arose. The archaeological and textual evidence suggests they were active economic institutions drawing significant agricultural surplus toward themselves, employing dependent labor at scale and functioning in a very real sense as one of the earliest and most consequential concentrations of institutional wealth and authority our species had ever produced. And once an institution like that exists, holding both the surplus and the record of who owes what to whom, it doesn't need brute force to maintain its position, at least not most of the time. It has something quieter and, in its own way, more durable. The simple, structural fact that almost nobody else in the community can check its arithmetic. This is also, not incidentally, the period in which we start to see the first clear evidence of organized, specialized roles that produce no food at all. Roles that only become possible once a surplus large enough and reliable enough exists to support people who spend their entire working lives doing something other than growing, gathering, or hunting their own dinner. Scribes obviously trained for years in an increasingly elaborate system of signs before they could produce a usable record. But also administrators, temple officials, skilled craft specialists producing goods for the temple economy rather than their own households. And increasingly, as these settlements grow into genuine cities, people whose entire function seems to have been enforcement, ensuring that labour obligations were met, that stored surplus wasn't quietly diverted, that the boundaries the temple and its allies had drawn around who owed what to whom were actually respected. None of this existed, could have existed, in the foraging world we open tonight's story in, a world where specialization was a matter of individual skill freely offered rather than institutional role rigidly assigned, where the closest thing to enforcement was the simple, ever-present option of a family or an individual walking away from a situation they didn't like and finding or forming a different group entirely. That option, walking away, is worth naming directly here, because it's the single clearest thing this whole chapter of the story takes from people, more than the walls, more than the debt itself. A forager who found themselves under an arrangement they didn't like could leave it, not without cost, not without real difficulty, but the option genuinely existed, and its existence functioned as a kind of natural check on how far any single person's power over another could actually extend, because power that no one has to submit to is power with a hard ceiling on it. A resident of a settlement like Uruk, with a house built with years of accumulated labour, a family buried underfoot, a debt recorded in an archive they likely couldn't read themselves, and increasingly walls around the whole city that made simply walking off into the countryside a far more dangerous and far less viable option than it had ever been for a mobile forager, did not have that same ceiling anymore. The record didn't just track what was owed, it quietly closed off the exit. We are, by this point in the story, a very long way from the lake shore at Ohalo and the mammoth bone camps of Dolny Vestonita we might have opened a very different kind of video with. We've traded a life of relative physical hardship, but real personal latitude for a life of relative material security, and, for a growing number of people, a kind of narrowing, recorded, enforceable dependency that simply had no precedent in the several 100,000 years that came before it. And it's here, in this precise arrangement of grain, record, and rank, that we finally arrive at the shape civilization was actually taking. Not villages anymore, not even large villages, but something we're finally justified in calling by a different name entirely, a city, with all the density, specialization and quiet, permanent inequality that word had come to imply. Let's step fully into that city now, because everything we've traced so far, the fields, the walls, the granaries, the tokens, the tablets, the scribes, was building. Whether anyone alive at the time could have seen it coming or not, towards something genuinely new in the history of our species. By the middle of the 4th millennium before the Common Era, Uruk had grown into something the world had simply never held before, a settlement whose population, by some estimates drawn from the extent of its excavated remains, may have reached somewhere in the range of 40,000 people or more within its walls by its height, a concentration of human beings in one place that would have been utterly unimaginable to anyone living in the small, scattered bands we spent our opening chapters among. To put that in perspective, a healthy, thriving hunter-gatherer band might number 30, maybe 50 people, and even the largest seasonal gatherings, the kind that may have drawn crowds to a place like Göbekli Tepe, were almost certainly temporary, dispersing again once the ritual season ended. Uruk didn't disperse. It stayed exactly where it was, and it kept growing. What made a concentration like that possible at all when it had never been possible before in the entire span of human existence comes down to the same grim, patient arithmetic we've been tracing since Chapter 1, agricultural surplus, reliably produced, reliably stored, and increasingly reliably extracted from the surrounding countryside by an institutional structure sophisticated enough to coordinate it. The fields around Uruk, worked by farming communities across the wider floodplain of the lower Tigris and Euphrates, produced far more grain than those communities needed simply to feed themselves, particularly once irrigation, a technology that itself required exactly the kind of large-scale, coordinated labor that only a settled, hierarchical society could organize, began pushing yields well beyond what rain-fed agriculture alone could produce in this arid landscape. That surplus, channeled inward toward the city through a combination of temple landholding, tribute, taxation in kind, and debt obligation, is what actually fed the 40,000 people living inside Uruk's walls, the overwhelming majority of whom were not growing their own food at all. And this is the detail worth sitting with for a moment, because it represents the final, full flowering of a shift we've been watching build in slow motion since we first stood in a mud brick farming village back in Chapter 6. In a foraging band, everyone more or less participated directly in the getting of food. There were no purely administrative specialists, no full-time artisans producing goods that had nothing to do with subsistence, no standing class of people whose entire working life was spent managing, recording, or enforcing, rather than gathering, hunting, or growing. Uruk broke that pattern completely and irreversibly. The archaeological and textual record from the city reveals an extraordinary range of specialized, non-food producing occupations, potters producing standardized, mass-manufactured vessels at genuinely industrial scale, some of the earliest evidence anywhere in the world of something resembling assembly line production. Metal workers, textile workers producing woven cloth in quantities large enough to function as a form of currency in their own right, traded outward along trade networks that by this point stretched remarkably far beyond the city itself. Temple officials, administrators, soldiers, in the more developed sense the word would come to carry, standing forces whose job was defense and enforcement rather than the occasional informal all-hands defense a threatened foraging band or early farming village might muster. None of these people fed themselves. All of them depended, entirely and without alternative, on a surplus that other people, mostly people they would never meet, produced on their behalf, extracted through a system of obligation, taxation and debt that the vast majority of the actual food producers had essentially no say in shaping. This is worth naming plainly, because it's the clearest, most concentrated form the whole trade we've been tracing all night finally takes. The farmer working the irrigated fields outside Uruk's walls was, in most respects that mattered day to day, considerably worse off than the forager we sat beside back at Ohalo 20,000 years ago in our first chapter. Shorter, sicker, working harder, eating a narrower diet, and now, on top of all of it, surrendering a substantial portion of every harvest to a city they might rarely if ever set foot inside, in exchange for a system of stored grain reserves, defence, and religious assurance that the whole arrangement, at some level none of them could fully verify, was working in their favour. The city, meanwhile, filled with specialists who had never touched a plough, produced the pottery, the textiles, the monumental temple architecture, and eventually the writing, mathematics, and early astronomy that we'd go on thousands of years later to celebrate as the true beginning of civilization, built, quite literally, on the backs and the bent spines of people whose lives had gotten measurably harder in almost every way that skeletal evidence can measure in order to make this concentration of specialists and monuments possible at all. And density, as we've already seen at a smaller scale back at Çatalhöyük, does not come free of cost, even setting the labour inequality aside entirely. A city of 40,000 people with sanitation systems that were rudimentary at best by any later standard, with humans and their domesticated animals living in closer and more sustained proximity than any population in human history had ever managed before, was an environment perfectly suited to the kind of infectious disease that simply could not sustain itself, could not find enough vulnerable hosts close enough together in the dispersed world of small foraging bands or even modest farming villages. We don't have detailed epidemiological records from this specific period. The written evidence for that comes later. But the pattern is one, epidemiologists and archaeologists studying the broader Neolithic and early urban transition have documented again and again, across different regions and different centuries, denser populations bringing denser exposure to pathogens, particularly the ones that had recently made the jump from the domesticated animals that early farmers and now city dwellers kept in ever closer proximity to themselves. The same density that made Uruk's specialization, its monuments and its administrative sophistication possible was also, quietly and continuously, making its population sicker in ways a scattered foraging population simply never had to contend with at the same scale. There's also, by this stage, unmistakable evidence of organized violence on a scale that dwarfs anything we saw earlier in tonight's story. The walls that first appeared tentative and singular around Jericho many centuries before this point have by now become a standard expected feature of major settlements across the region, And the iconography that survives from this period, carved into cylinder seals and monumental relief, increasingly depicts something we hadn't really seen clearly before: organized military conflict, ranks of soldiers, captured prisoners, and rulers depicted with explicit symbols of martial authority and conquest. This is the point in the story where warfare stops looking like the occasional small-scale violence we glimpsed at Nataruk and starts looking like something closer to what we'd recognize as war in the fuller sense of the word: organized, sustained, waged between political entities large enough to field something resembling an army, over resources, territory, and the control of exactly the kind of stored agricultural surplus. This whole story has been circling since its very first chapter. The granary that needed a wall to protect it in a small Levantine village has become a city that needs an army. It's worth asking honestly, before we close tonight's chapters here, whether the people living through this transformation from farming village to walled, stratified, specialist-filled city understood what they were building, or what it was costing the people at the bottom of it. Almost certainly not in any way we'd recognize as a conscious, deliberate choice. Nobody sat down at the founding of Uruk and decided to trade the physical health, personal autonomy, and rough egalitarianism of the deep past for monumental architecture, specialized craft, and a system of debt and obligation that would quietly bind the majority of the population to labor they had little power to refuse. It accumulated the way almost everything in this story has accumulated, one small, locally reasonable decision at a time, a bit more surplus stored here, a slightly larger house built there, a debt recorded and left unpaid, a wall raised a little higher, a record kept a little more carefully, until the accumulated weight of 10,000 small, reasonable decisions had produced something no single person along the way could have designed on purpose, and very few of them, looking honestly at their own aching backs and their children's stunted growth, would have chosen if they'd been shown, all at once, exactly where it was leading. That's where we'll leave the city for tonight, walls standing taller than Jericho's ever did, granaries feeding specialists who've never touched a plough, tablets recording debts that will outlive the people who owe them, and somewhere out past those walls, in fields worked by people whose bones will one day tell archaeologists exactly how hard this trade actually was, the last quiet, scattered pockets of the old world we opened this story inside of, still hunting, still gathering, still watching the walled cities rise on the horizon, and still, in more places and for longer than the old triumphant story ever gave them credit for, choosing not to walk through the gates. Let's step back from the granary now and look at the person standing beside it, because somewhere in the space between the temple's stored surplus and the tablets recording who owed what to whom, a new kind of human being starts to appear in the record, one who had no real equivalent in anything we've traced so far tonight. Not a skilled hunter, not a respected elder, not even, strictly speaking, a wealthy household head in the sense we'd recognize from the growing farming villages a few chapters back. Something closer to a ruler. And the strange thing, if you go looking for the moment this figure first steps clearly into view, is how blurry the line is between the priest managing a god's storehouse and the king managing a city's population. Because for a very long stretch of this story, they seem to have been almost the same job wearing two different names. At Uruk, the title that shows up again and again in the earliest administrative texts is usually translated as something like Lord or En, a figure who appears to have combined religious authority, the management of the temple's considerable land holdings, and, increasingly, some form of political leadership over the wider settlement, all folded into one office. This is worth sitting with because it tells us something about how power actually consolidates in a world like this one. It doesn't arrive as a conquering general, seizing a throne by force, at least not at first. It arrives through bookkeeping, through the slow, unglamorous accumulation of the right to decide how a shared surplus gets allocated, until the person or institution holding that right has, almost without anyone voting on it or fighting a war over it, become the closest thing this city has to a government. You've probably been told, if you've encountered this period of history before, that kingship arrived through conquest, one strong man beating his rivals into submission and crowning himself ruler. The evidence from this earliest layer of Mesopotamian urban life tells a quieter and, in its way, more unsettling story. Here, authority seems to have grown out of administration itself, out of the simple, structural fact that someone had to decide how the grain got divided, and whoever that someone was, generation after generation, ended up holding something that looked less like a job and more, slowly, like a birthright. Centuries after the period we're sitting in tonight, the Sumerians themselves would look back at this deep past and try to make sense of it, producing what modern scholars call the Sumerian King List, a document that claims kingship itself descended from heaven, passed from city to city, with reigns for the earliest rulers stretched out to tens of thousands of years, a figure said to have ruled for over 40,000 years, another for well over 30,000. No serious historian reads these numbers literally, but it's worth pausing on why a much later society, one that had already lived for 1,000 years under kings, priests, and formal law, felt the need to tell itself a story where kingship had always existed, handed down from the gods themselves rather than accumulated, piece by piece, out of grain tallies and temple ledgers by ordinary mortal administrators. A myth like that does real work. It makes something that was actually built, slowly, unevenly, out of surplus and record-keeping, look instead like it had simply always been the natural order of things, which is precisely the kind of story a system built on inherited advantage tends to need in order to feel less like an arrangement and more like a fact of nature. What we can actually see in the archaeology of this period, rather than the later myth-making about it, is something more modest, but arguably more revealing. We see monumental building projects at Uruk on a scale that dwarfs anything the settlement had produced before. Temple complexes rebuilt and expanded repeatedly across generations, requiring the kind of sustained, coordinated labour that only a population already accustomed to organised, hierarchical work could have produced. We see cylinder seals, small carved stones rolled across wet clay to leave a unique, repeatable image, used not for decoration, but for authentication, a signature system that lets specific individuals and institutions mark goods, seal storerooms, and verify transactions in a world where trust could no longer simply live in a shared memory the way it had for the small foraging bands we opened this story among. And we see, increasingly, imagery of a single figure, larger than the others around him in the relief carvings that survive from this period, engaged in acts that later ages would recognize immediately as the business of kingship, presiding over offerings, standing before captured enemies, receiving tribute from a kneeling population. The proportions in this art aren't accidental. In a world without written titles yet fully developed, size on a carved surface was itself a kind of language, and the language being spoken here more clearly with each passing generation was one of concentrated personal authority. And here's where the thread we picked up 2 chapters ago, the birth of recorded debt, braids directly into the birth of the ruler standing over it all, because a debt that can be written down and enforced needs an enforcer, and the archives from this period increasingly hint at what happened to households that fell too far behind. We don't have detailed legal codes surviving from quite this early. Those come later, most famously in documents like the laws attributed to a king named Ur-Nammu, and, later still, the far more extensive code associated with Hammurabi, both from Mesopotamian city-states considerably after the period we're sitting in tonight. But those later codes didn't invent the practices they describe out of nothing. They wrote down, formalized, and gave royal weight to arrangements that the archaeological and textual record suggests had almost certainly already been operating, informally and then increasingly formally, for a very long time, before anyone thought to carve them into stone. Among the practices those later codes address directly is debt bondage, the situation in which a household that cannot repay what it owes surrenders a family member, sometimes a child, sometimes a wife, into the service of the creditor until the debt is considered paid. It's one of the starkest possible illustrations of the distance we've travelled since the opening of tonight's story, from a forager who could walk away from an arrangement that no longer suited them, to a farmer whose entire household, including the people inside it, could become collateral for a bad harvest, recorded patiently and without sympathy on a piece of fired clay. It would be a mistake to tell this part of the story as though everyone living inside this new hierarchy experienced it purely as oppression, and it's worth resisting that flattening the same way we resisted flattening the earlier chapters of the trade. The temple economy at Uruk, whatever its costs, also appears to have functioned as a genuine safety net for at least some portion of the population, distributing rations to widows, orphans, and dependent labourers in a way that a purely individual household working its own small plot with no institutional backing at all might not have been able to guarantee for itself in a bad year. Centralized storage for all the inequality it eventually produced really did buffer against the kind of total catastrophic famine that could wipe out an isolated farming household with no reserves of its own. The trade, once again, wasn't purely a loss dressed up as a gain, nor purely a gain worth its cost. It was both at once a system that made some kinds of catastrophe less likely, while making an entirely new kind of quiet, grinding, generational catastrophe, the catastrophe of permanent, inherited dependency, possible for the first time in the history of our species. What's genuinely new here, and worth naming plainly before we move on, is the emergence of something we might call impersonal power, authority, that no longer depends on the ruler personally out-hunting you, out-arguing you, or out-charming you, the way influence had to be earned and re-earned in the foraging world we opened tonight's story inside of, the The Lord of Uruk didn't need to beat you in a foot race or tell a better story around the fire than you could tell. He, and by this period the evidence strongly suggests it was overwhelmingly a he, needed only to control the archive, the granary, and increasingly the small class of specialists, scribes, soldiers, temple officials, whose own survival now depended on that system continuing to function exactly as it had been built to function. Power, for the first time in this long human story, had detached itself from the direct, personal, constantly re-earned respect of the foraging band and attached itself instead to an office, a title, a role that could be filled by different individuals across generations while the underlying structure of who owed what to whom and who got to decide stayed essentially the same. That's a genuinely new kind of thing for a human society to build, and once it exists, it doesn't easily go away because, unlike a charismatic hunter's earned authority, which dies more or less when the hunter does, an office simply gets refilled, and the system beneath it keeps running. We'll leave the throne room, such as it was, here for tonight, because there's a quieter, more intimate cost sitting just beneath all of this political architecture, one that rarely gets its own chapter in the popular telling of this story, and it has to do with something we haven't looked at closely yet, the specific weight this whole transformation placed on women's bodies, women's labour, and women's lives. In a way, the evidence increasingly suggests looked very different from how things had worked in the world we opened this story inside of 20,000 years, and what feels, by now, like an entirely different species of human experience ago. Let's go back for a moment to a detail we touched on early in tonight's story and didn't fully sit with, because it's easy to let it pass as a small technical aside when it's actually one of the more consequential shifts in this entire transformation. We mentioned several chapters ago that skeletal remains from early farming women across the Fertile Crescent and later Neolithic Europe show pronounced repetitive strain damage in the knees, spine, and arms. Damage researchers connect directly to the specific, grinding hour after hour labour of processing grain by hand. It's worth actually picturing what that labour looked like, because the archaeological reconstruction is unusually vivid here. A quern, a simple saddle-shaped stone, sits on the ground or on a low platform. A woman kneels over it day after day, rocking a smaller handstone back and forth across a bed of grain, grinding it down into something fine enough to cook, a task that could easily consume 2 or 3 hours of continuous, repetitive, lower back curving effort every single day, just to produce enough flour to feed a household through the next 24 hours. Do that for years. Do it for a lifetime. The skeletal evidence recovered from sites across this period, particularly the striking bowing and wear patterns found in the arm and shoulder bones, and the corresponding stress found in the toes and knees from the specific kneeling posture the work required, doesn't just tell us that grinding grain was hard. It tells us who was doing it, disproportionately, and how much of their physical lives it consumed. This wasn't, it's worth being clear, some kind of accident of biology dictating that women alone were suited to this labour. The foraging world we spent our earliest chapters in tonight had its own gendered patterns, hunting skewed toward men in most, though notably not all, documented forager societies, gathering more evenly shared or skewed toward women. But the crucial difference is that gathering in a forager's world was varied, mobile, and, by most ethnographic and archaeological measures, considerably less physically punishing than the specific, narrow, repetitive labour grain processing demanded. A forager gathering wild tubers, nuts and greens across a shifting landscape was using a wide range of movements, walking, digging, climbing, carrying, across a varied terrain that changed day to day and season to season. A farming woman grinding grain was performing essentially the same narrow, joint punishing motion for hours in the same spot, day after day, for her entire adult life. The work hadn't simply moved from one gender to another. It had narrowed, intensified, and repeated itself in a way nothing in the previous several 100,000 years of human labour quite had. And grinding grain was only the most physically visible part of a much broader shift in what settled agrarian life demanded specifically of women's time and bodies. Sedentism, the simple fact of staying in one place rather than moving with the seasons, appears to have changed something even more fundamental than the daily workload. And this is where the evidence, though still actively debated among researchers, points toward one of the most consequential and least discussed shifts in this entire story: the spacing between births. Mobile foraging life. The evidence from studies of modern forager populations like the Hadza and the Juhuansi suggests tends to produce longer intervals between children, likely driven by a combination of factors. The physical demands of carrying an infant and its older siblings across long daily foraging distances, extended and intensive breastfeeding, which can suppress fertility for a considerable stretch after birth, and possibly leaner average body fat, which itself has documented effects on female fertility and cycle regularity. A woman living a settled, agricultural life, no longer needing to carry a toddler for miles every day, with a more consistent, if less varied, caloric supply from stored grain, appears in the broader demographic and skeletal record to have been able to, and likely did, bear children at meaningfully shorter intervals. This single shift, easy to overlook next to the walls and the tablets, may actually be one of the most powerful engines driving everything else in tonight's story, because a population that can have more children, more often, is a population that grows, and a population that grows is a population that needs more grain, more land, more labour, and eventually more of exactly the kind of coordination, storage, and control this whole story has been tracing since the very first granary went up behind Jericho's tower. But shorter birth intervals mean something else too, something that lands directly and repeatedly on the body of the woman living through them. A life stretched across pregnancy, birth, and nursing, with far less room between each cycle than her forager ancestors would likely have experienced, layered directly on top of the daily physical demands of grinding, weaving, and tending a household rooted permanently in one place rather than distributed across a mobile band's shared labour. And here we start to see in the growing archaeological record of grave goods and burial patterns across this period the faint but increasingly visible outlines of a gap opening not just between wealthy and poor households, which we already traced a few chapters back, but between the status and treatment of men and women within those households. It's not a uniform picture, and it's worth resisting the temptation to flatten thousands of years and dozens of distinct cultures into one simple story of universal patriarchal descent. Some sites from this broad period show relatively balanced burial treatment between men and women. Others show a widening asymmetry, richer grave goods, more elaborate burial, consistently favouring male skeletons as the centuries pass, particularly as we move into the more stratified temple and palace economies, like the one we spent the last chapter standing inside at Uruk. What the textual record from Uruk itself adds to this picture, once writing exists to record it, is genuinely striking, and it complicates the story in an interesting direction. The administrative archives from the temple economy show large numbers of women organized into what amount to industrial-scale textile workshops, weaving wool into cloth that functioned as one of the most important traded commodities in the entire regional economy, alongside grain itself. This tells us two things at once, and they sit uneasily beside each other. On one hand, women's specialized labor was clearly central, not peripheral, to the economic engine of the earliest cities, valuable enough to be organized, tracked, and rationed with the same careful administrative attention given to grain and metal. On the other hand, the ration lists recording what these women received for that labour show them, in many recorded cases, receiving smaller allotments than men performing comparable categories of work, a documented, numerical, black and white record of unequal compensation that is, in its own quiet way, one of the earliest written traces of gendered economic inequality our species ever produced. It's a strange, uncomfortable thing to sit with, a system sophisticated enough to organize women's labor at genuine industrial scale, and, in that same system's own records, sophisticated enough to shortchange it. This is worth placing back against the world we opened tonight's story inside of, not to romanticize it into some lost feminist utopia, because the ethnographic and archaeological evidence for gender relations among Paleolithic foragers is itself contested and incomplete, but because the contrast helps clarify exactly what shifted and why. In a mobile band, a woman's economic contribution, gathering the majority of the group's daily calories in most documented forager societies, was direct, visible, and immediate, converted straight into food that fed her family and her band that same day or week, without an institution standing between her labour and its reward. Once that labour gets folded into a temple workshop, tracked on a ration list, and compensated according to a scale someone else set and someone else enforced, the directness of that old relationship between effort and reward disappears, replaced by exactly the kind of institutional dependency we've been tracing across this entire second half of tonight's story, except now landing with particular concentrated weight on the bodies and the working lives of women specifically. None of this means the trade we've been tracing all night fell only on women, or that men escaped its costs. The skeletal evidence for repetitive strain, shortened stature, and poorer nutrition runs through farming populations of every description in this period, regardless of gender. But it's worth naming, before we move deeper into tonight's closing chapters, that the specific shape of this cost, who ground the grain, who wove the cloth, who bore the children at shortened intervals, who appears smaller and more poorly compensated in the very first written economic records our species ever produced, was not evenly distributed, and the fault lines that opened here quietly in workshops and grinding stones and ration lists roughly 5,000 years before the Common Era are fault lines that, in one form or another, an uncomfortable number of human societies would go on carrying forward for a very long time after tonight's story ends. We'll leave that thread here, not resolved, because it wasn't resolved for the people living inside it either, and turn now towards something that touches every household in this new world, regardless of who was grinding the grain or weaving the cloth. The question of what all of this density, labour, and inequality was actually doing to the human mind and body at the most intimate level, in the years and the diseases and the disorders that this new way of living had made possible for the very first time. Let's talk now about what all of this actually did to the body, not in the broad strokes we've already covered, height and teeth and joints, but in the more specific, more unsettling register of disease itself, because this is where the story of settled life reveals one of its strangest and most literal costs, written not in grave goods or ration lists, but directly into bone. In 2008, off the coast of what is now northern Israel, marine archaeologists diving at a site called Atlit Yam, a Neolithic village now submerged beneath the Mediterranean, recovered the skeleton of a young woman and her infant, dated to roughly 9,000 years before the present. Both showed clear, unmistakable skeletal signatures of tuberculosis, among the earliest confirmed cases of the disease found anywhere in the world. This detail matters more than it might first appear, because tuberculosis in the specific form that has plagued human populations for thousands of years afterward is now understood by researchers to have evolved out of much older bacterial strains through the kind of close, sustained contact between humans and their newly domesticated cattle that simply did not exist before settled farming brought the two species into permanent proximity. Atlit Yam wasn't a fluke or an outlier. It's a data point in a pattern that repeats, with variation, across the archaeological record of early farming settlements throughout the region, evidence that a disease we now think of as an old, familiar affliction of crowded human history had a specific birthplace, and that birthplace was exactly the kind of settled, animal-adjacent village we've spent the last several chapters standing inside. What makes this genuinely disorienting, if you sit with it long enough, is realizing how much of what we think of as simply the ordinary background hazard of human existence, the diseases that show up in every history book, every plague narrative, every account of ancient and medieval suffering, didn't actually exist for the overwhelming majority of our species' time on this planet. For the roughly 300,000 years anatomically modern humans had already been alive before the period we opened tonight's story inside of, living in small, mobile, low-density bands, moving on before waste, parasites, and pathogens could build up in one place. Most of these diseases either didn't exist in a form capable of infecting humans at all, or existed only as isolated, sporadic spillovers that a small, scattered population's own mobility would have helped contain. An outbreak burning through one band and then, quite literally, having nowhere else to go, because there was no dense, permanent, interconnected settlement pattern for it to spread through. Settled farming life broke every one of those natural fire breaks at once, and it broke them in a way that compounded across every single shift we've already traced tonight. Permanent housing meant human waste accumulating in fixed locations rather than being left behind with each seasonal move. Domesticated livestock, kept in close, continuous proximity for the first time in human history meant a whole new category of pathogens suddenly had a bridge species standing right beside the humans it would eventually learn to infect. Stored grain meant rodents, and the fleas rodents carried, moving into human settlements in numbers a mobile forager camp would never have sustained. And growing population density, the very thing agricultural surplus had made possible in the first place, meant that once a pathogen did successfully make the jump from animal to human, it now had exactly the kind of large, permanently interconnected pool of potential hosts it needed to establish itself as an ongoing, self-sustaining human disease, rather than a dead-end, spillover event that simply burned out. Measles, in later, subsequent chapters of human history we won't fully reach tonight, traces its likely origins to a virus that infected cattle. Various strains of influenza trace theirs to birds and pigs, both drawn into unusually close human contact by exactly this kind of settled, mixed farming arrangement. Smallpox's ultimate animal origin remains more contested among researchers, but its explosive spread absolutely depended on the dense, interconnected populations that only became possible once this transition we've spent all night tracing had run its course. It's worth being precise about what this actually meant for the people living through it, because it's easy, at this historical distance, to talk about zoonotic spillover, the way you discuss a chemistry experiment, clinically, without feeling the weight of what it was like to actually live inside a population, discovering, generation after generation, an entirely new category of threat it had no evolved defenses against and no accumulated cultural memory for managing. A forager band that lost a member to a hunting accident or even to one of the sporadic infectious illnesses that did exist in the pre-agricultural world was drawing on tens of thousands of years of accumulated practical and ritual knowledge about how to understand and respond to death and illness within their community. A farming village encountering for the first time in human experience a disease that could sweep through an entire settlement in weeks, killing indiscriminately, with no herbal remedy or ritual practice built up over generations to address it, because the disease itself had never existed in a form capable of doing this before, was navigating something genuinely and terrifyingly new. Some researchers studying the deep roots of religious and mythological traditions across the ancient Near East have pointed to exactly this period as fertile ground for a wave of new anxieties finding their way into ritual and myth. Stories of plague sent by angry gods, of communities struck down for some collective transgression, narratives that may reflect, however imperfectly translated through thousands of years of retelling, the genuine disorienting terror of populations encountering mass, unexplained death at a scale and speed the old, dispersed world had simply never produced. And disease wasn't the only new burden settled density placed on the body and mind together, because there's a second, quieter category of cost worth naming here, one that doesn't leave the same clear signature in bone that tuberculosis or malnutrition does, but that researchers studying stress physiology increasingly believe left its own kind of mark. The human stress response, the cascade of cortisol and adrenaline that floods the body in moments of danger, evolved across those same several 100,000 years of mobile forager life to handle acute, short-term threats. A predator in the grass, a sudden confrontation, a dangerous river crossing, threats that resolved quickly, one way or another, and then released their grip on the body. What settled, hierarchical, surplus-dependent life appears to have introduced, for the first time at real scale, was something closer to chronic stress, the low-grade, unresolved ongoing pressure of debt that doesn't simply end, of status that must be constantly defended rather than periodically demonstrated, of a harvest that might fail months from now in a way no amount of vigilance today can fully guard against. A forager's fear tended to have a clear beginning and a clear end. A farmer's fear, once grain could be owed, land could be lost, and a bad season could cascade into debt bondage for a child increasingly didn't. It's genuinely difficult to find direct skeletal evidence of ancient chronic stress in the way we can find evidence of malnutrition or infection, but researchers working at the intersection of archaeology and physiology have pointed to indirect markers, patterns in tooth enamel formed during periods of developmental stress that show up more frequently and more severely in farming populations than in the foraging populations that preceded them in the same regions. Evidence, however, indirect, of bodies built and grown under conditions of sustained pressure that the deep human past had never really demanded before. Taken together, this is the fuller shape of the cost tonight's story has been slowly assembling since its opening image of a hut on the shore of a Levantine lake. Shorter bodies, worse teeth, harder joints, new diseases with no evolved defense against them, and a nervous system built by 300,000 years of one kind of threat, now living inside an environment that had, in the space of a few thousand years, an eye blink by the standards of human evolutionary time, generated an entirely different kind of threat altogether, chronic, institutional, slow-moving, and very often impossible to simply run from. And this, finally, brings us to the question that's been sitting underneath every chapter of tonight's story, quietly, waiting for us to actually look at it directly. Once all of this had happened, once the walls were up, the debts were recorded, the diseases had taken root, and the population had grown too large and too dependent on stored surplus to simply scatter back into the old mobile world, was there ever, at any point, a way back? Let's sit with that question directly now, because it's the one this whole story has been circling since the very first chapter, and the honest answer is more unsettling than either a clean yes or a clean no. Was there a way back? Could the people living inside these walled, stratified, disease-ridden, debt-bound cities have simply chosen, collectively, to walk away from the whole arrangement and return to the healthier, more varied, more physically balanced life their forager ancestors had lived for hundreds of thousands of years before them? The archaeological and demographic evidence suggests, with a bluntness that's worth sitting with rather than softening, that the honest answer is almost certainly no, and understanding exactly why not is, in its own way, the most important idea in tonight's entire story. The trap, and researchers who study this transition increasingly do use language close to that word, wasn't primarily a trap of individual willpower or a trap of people simply forgetting how to forage. It was a trap of population math, and population math, once it gets moving, doesn't particularly care what any individual household would prefer. We touched on this back when we widened the lens to watch farming spread across Europe, the observation that agriculture's real advantage was never really that it made individual lives better. The skeletal evidence tells us fairly clearly that in most measurable respects it didn't, but that it could support dramatically more people on the same amount of land. A hunting and gathering territory that might sustainably feed 30 or 40 people across a given season in careful, rotating balance with the plants and animals living there could, once converted to intensive cereal cultivation, support many times that number. Not healthier people, not happier people by most reasonable measures, but more of them, packed more densely onto the same acreage. And population, once it grows to fill the capacity a new food system makes possible, cannot simply shrink itself back down again without something very close to catastrophe. A farming region that had grown to support, say, 10 times the population its land could have sustained under the old foraging system had no realistic path back to foraging that didn't involve 9 out of every 10 people either starving, migrating into already occupied territory that had no room for them, or being violently displaced by neighbours facing exactly the same impossible math. The door hadn't just closed. The room on the other side of it had been demolished and built over. This is worth pairing with something else the evidence shows fairly clearly, which is that individual households and even entire communities at various points across this long transition absolutely did try to walk back through that door, or at least hesitate at its threshold. And the record of those hesitations is one of the more human, more sympathetic threads running through this whole story. We mentioned several chapters ago the long, patient standoff along parts of the Atlantic coast of Europe, foraging communities living for centuries directly alongside established farming populations, watching, trading, and quite deliberately choosing not to cross over, even with full knowledge of exactly what farming involved. There's evidence from multiple regions and multiple periods of this broader transition of what some archaeologists have described as partial or failed reversions. Communities that appear, based on shifts in the material record, to have scaled back cultivation and returned to a more mobile, more foraging-reliant way of life for a stretch of time, sometimes in response to a failed harvest, sometimes in response to disease, sometimes for reasons the archaeology simply can't recover. These attempts tell us something important, that the pull of the old world hadn't vanished, that people living inside the new one weren't simply blind to what they'd traded away. But they also tell us, in the fact, that these reversions were almost always partial, almost always temporary, almost always eventually followed by a return to intensified cultivation, rather than a permanent retreat from it, that the underlying population pressure driving the whole system kept reasserting itself, kept pulling communities back toward the fields, generation after generation, no matter how clearly any individual generation might have understood the cost. There's also a harder, more structural piece of the trap worth naming plainly, which is that by this point in the story, the world the old foraging life depended on had itself been changed by farming's spread in ways that made a full return meaningfully harder, even for communities that might have wanted one. Wild game populations in regions that had supported dense human hunting for generations, especially larger, slower reproducing species, appear in a number of regions to have declined under sustained pressure, some to the point of full local extinction over the many centuries this transition played out. Land that had once supported diverse, self-sustaining wild plant communities had, In many of the most productive foraging territories, precisely the territories most likely to have attracted the first cultivators in the first place, been cleared, cultivated, and altered in ways that made a simple reversion to the old wild abundance considerably less available than it had been 20,000 years before, even setting the population question aside entirely. The world the first successful foragers had read so fluently at the opening of tonight's story, the world of predictable herds and dense wild grain stands and generous, varied abundance, wasn't simply waiting patiently on the other side of a door people could walk back through whenever they liked. In more than one region, farming itself and the population growth and land use it had already produced had begun quietly closing off the very abundance that had made the old life possible in the first place. So where does that leave the honest answer to tonight's central question, whether this whole arrangement on balance across all the chapters we've walked through together was worth what it cost? It's worth resisting one last time the temptation to resolve that question too cleanly in either direction, because the evidence genuinely doesn't support a clean answer, and a story that pretended otherwise would be doing exactly the same flattening we've been trying to avoid all night. The individual forager standing at the edge of this transition, faced with a genuine, if narrowing, choice, was very likely correct to hesitate, correct to recognize that the specific life on offer on the other side of that choice, harder labor, poorer nutrition, new disease, new hierarchy, new dependency, represented a real and measurable decline in almost everything the body and, quite possibly, the mind had evolved across hundreds of thousands of years to expect from a well-lived life. And yet the civilization that trade eventually built, the cities, the writing, the accumulated knowledge passed down, not through fragile living memory, but through durable external record, the sheer scale of coordinated human effort that made possible everything from monumental architecture to eventually medicine, sophisticated enough to treat the very diseases this transition had introduced in the first place, represents something genuinely unprecedented too. Something the scattered, healthier, more leisurely world of the deep past, for all its real virtues, could never have produced on its own. It wasn't a mistake in the sense of a simple error correctable with better information. It was, more precisely, an unplanned and irreversible wager, made under real pressure by people who could not see and had no way of seeing exactly what they were signing their descendants up for. A wager that paid off in ways its makers could never have imagined, and cost in ways they could never have fully anticipated either. And once it was made, there was, for reasons written into the population math itself, no honest way to take it back. And that, more than any single chapter we've walked through tonight, is the actual shape of the story, not a straight staircase toward progress, not a simple fall from a forager's paradise, but a door that closed quietly behind an entire species while it was looking the other way. And it's worth sitting with that shape for one more chapter tonight, because the door hasn't opened again since, and in ways that are worth naming gently as you lie there in the dark. Some version of that closed door is still standing directly behind you. Let's bring this all the way home now, because everything we've traced tonight, the walls, the debts, the calendars, the grinding stones, the diseases that learned to live in us, didn't stop happening once the chapter ended. It kept going, kept compounding, kept building on itself for another 10,000 years, through empires and collapses and rebuilding, through the invention of money and law, and eventually clocks and factories, and closer to where you're lying right now, screens that never quite let the day end the way a sunset used to end it. And somewhere, underneath all of that accumulated weight, the body listening to this story right now is still, in almost every way that matters, biologically the same body that once knew how to read a landscape the way you read a page, the same nervous system that evolved across those long hundreds of thousands of years to expect movement, variety, close and constant company, and a fire at the center of the night rather than a blue light at the edge of it. This is what researchers studying human evolution and modern health increasingly call evolutionary mismatch. The idea that the environment we live in now has changed in the span of a few thousand years so much faster and so much further than our biology has had any chance to keep pace with, that a great many of the struggles we quietly carry, the low hum of anxiety that doesn't seem to have a clear cause, the restlessness that shows up right around the time you're supposed to be falling asleep, the sense of being surrounded by more people than you've ever truly known and somehow lonelier for it, may not be malfunctions at all. They may be a perfectly healthy, perfectly ancient nervous system, the same one that once helped a forager read the crossing point of a reindeer herd or the ripening of a wild grain stand, doing exactly what it was built to do, inside an environment it was never built for. You were not designed for a room with no natural light. You were not designed to owe a specific, numbered amount to an institution that will never learn your name, the direct descendant, however many layers removed, of the very first debt ever pressed into a piece of wet clay at Uruk. You were not designed to sleep in an apartment built 200 feet above the ground, disconnected by walls of concrete from every other body in the building, in a way that would have been almost unimaginable to a species that spent nearly its entire history sleeping in close, warm, overlapping proximity to a dozen or more people it trusted completely. And yet here's the strange, quiet comfort tucked inside that mismatch if you let yourself sit with it the way we've been sitting with everything else tonight. Because the body that carries all of that old, ill-fitting evolutionary hardware also still remembers, somewhere underneath 10,000 years of walls and ledgers and calendars, what it actually wanted in the first place. Firelight still slows the human nervous system down in ways cold, blue-toned light simply doesn't. And researchers studying sleep and light exposure have found real, measurable differences in melatonin production between the two, a small physical echo of 1,000,000 ordinary nights spent watching flames instead of screens. The particular, low, unhurried cadence of a human voice telling a long story in the dark, the exact thing happening right now, activates something in the nervous system that a scrolling feed of disconnected information simply does not. A pattern of listening our species spent its entire early history practicing. Around exactly this kind of fire long before there was any agriculture, any debt, any wall to interrupt it. You cannot walk back through the door that closed behind our species somewhere in the hill country of the Fertile Crescent 10,000 years ago. Nobody can. The population math that sealed it shut for good. But you can, in small, private, unglamorous ways, on an ordinary night like tonight, borrow back a few of the things that were sitting on the other side of it: slowness, darkness, an unhurried voice, the low animal comfort of simply lying still and being told a story until the story and the mind following it both go quiet. We've walked a long way together tonight, from a hut on the shore of an ancient lake to a temple ledger in the world's first city, from the earliest planted row of wild wheat to the walls, the debts, and the diseases that grew up around it, and none of it can be undone. And very little of it was anyone's fault in the way we usually mean that word. It was closer to weather, a slow, patient, irreversible shift that arrived the way the younger Dryas itself arrived, quietly, without asking permission, and simply kept moving forward once it had started. You are, whether you fall asleep in the next few minutes or stay with this a little longer, the direct, unbroken inheritor of every single choice we've walked through tonight, the granaries, the walls, the grinding stones, the tablets, carrying inside your own tired, ordinary body a nervous system built for a fire that mostly isn't there anymore. So let this be the fire, just for tonight. Let your shoulders drop the rest of the way. There's nothing left to plant, nothing left to guard, nothing owed to anyone until morning. Sleep well, fellow sapiens. I'll see you in the next one.